Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all here in this session at TNV Academy. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today our eminent speaker, Mr. Apoor Malik from Lucknow, India, who is going to talk about information security risk assessment. This is the topic in which we should all be deeply interested, as information security risk assessment is the key inclination for effective implementation of this standard in any organization. So it is very important to know about information security risk assessment. In this webinar today, Mr. Malik will discuss this topic in detail along with some real life examples he has experienced in industry. Our distinguished speaker, Mr. Pur Malik, has done his post graduation from Gautam Buddha Technical University, India, in computer application stream. He is also a lead auditor in ISO 27001. He has an industrial experience of around 8 years in information technology and e-commerce sector. He has been imparting training to a number of organizations, entrepreneurs, and executives on various topics related to ISO 27001. It was just a brief introduction of our guest speaker. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Apoor Malik. I may request Mr. Malik now to please start your session on information security risk assessment.
Thank you, Mr. Satain, for giving me this opportunity today. As already mentioned by you, the today's discussion topic is information security risk assessment. I would now start my session, and we should first look at the basic definition of risk assessment. So friends, before we move into the details of what risk assessment process is, we should know about the basic definition of information security risk assessment. By risk assessment, we mean the process through which an organization can identify the potential hazards to its operations and how they can impact its overall business if they occur. In simpler words, we can say it is an activity which helps the organization to identify what all things can be roadblocks to its smooth functioning and to its primary objectives. If we look at this particular definition, then it is a very generic definition of risk assessment which can be identified by any organization. But however, because we are talking about information security risk assessment, we should learn the definition of risk assessment in relation with information security. So if we talk about risk assessment in relation to information security, then it means that an organization must have a risk assessment process to identify the potential risks to its information security and associated processes. An organization should identify what are the risks to its information security assets, its resources, its relationship with customers and stakeholders, etc. While an organization conducts the risk assessment process, it looks for vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are present around its assets, which can make it more susceptible to damage from a hazard. Now, basically, the risk assessment process includes a three-stage strategy, which is stated below, or which I'm going to tell you, and which is also shown in a sample figure as well. You can see this particular image on your screen as of now. This is a particular process through which the risk assessment completely goes on within an organization. The first stage is hazard identification, in which organization identify the potential hazards and lists them. If we see in this particular picture, we can see that the first stage has been mentioned as hazard identification and several hazards has been written down. Fire, explosion, natural hazards, hazardous materials spill or release, terrorism, workplace violence, pandemic disease, utility outage, mechanical breakdown, supply failure, cyber attack. These are the few hazards which have been identified by an organization. And I must tell you here that these are only a sample hazards. These hazards will not be similar for any organization. It is just a sample. It is just an example that these hazards can be identified by an organization. The second stage is vulnerability assessment, which states that what assets of the organization can be at risk due to these identified hazards. Now, as we see in the figure as well, the second stage is assets at risk by the hazards which has been mentioned in the first image. So the assets which will be at risk might be people, property including buildings, critical infrastructure, supply chain, systems, equipment, information technology, business operations, reputation of the confidence in entity, regulatory and contractual obligations, environment. And the final stage is the impact analysis, which gives an idea that if these hazards occur, what will be their effect on the organization. Now, once we have identified the hazards, we have identified what assets are at risk due to these hazards. We calculate the impacts that will be on the organization due to these hazards in place. So impacts can be casualties, property damage, business interruption, loss of customers, financial loss, environmental contamination, loss of confidence in the organization, fines and penalties, lawsuits. Again, at the end, I would like to say that these are only sample figures which are shown over here. It doesn't mean that every organization will find the similar hazards, the similar risk assets, the similar impacts. Based on the nature of the working of the organization, they might find different kind of hazards, different kind of risk assets which are at risk, and different kind of impact. So if we move forward, we should now learn, as I have already mentioned, that hazards are identified during the risk assessment process, but we need to learn first that what are hazards and what they can be. So hazards are basically of three major categories. The first one is natural hazards, which might include meteorological, biological, or geological hazards. Second one can be human caused hazards, which can be accident at workplace, strikes, malware attack, hacking, fraud, denial of service, etc. Third one can be technological hazards, which can be loss of connectivity, hardware failure, lost or corrupted data, application failure, electrical power, supply failure, transportation, interruption, etc. So basically, the whole risk assessment process is a three-stage process which is being displayed here. Once, at first, the organization has to find the hazards, the potential hazards. The second one, it should have to identify what will be the assets which will be at risk due to these identified hazards. And third one is calculation of the impact of these hazards on organization, different processes and procedures. Now, what will be the process for successful implementation of risk assessment process? So once an organization has decided already that they will have to conduct a risk assessment process, they need to identify a process through which they will do it. So for an effective implementation of the risk assessment process, an organization should follow the five-step approach as it has been listed below. The first step should be establishing a risk management framework. What does this sentence mean? It means that the organization must find a suitable procedure through which it will conduct the risk assessment process. It should have to identify a capable set of people who will be doing this particular risk assessment at a regular period of time. They must have the complete knowledge of how the risk assessment process has to be done. So a complete framework will be calculated by the organization and will be included as a part of the risk assessment process. Second step would be identifying the risk. So once the risk management framework has been decided, the organization will go on and identify the potential risks to its different process and procedures. So they might have to go department wise as well. They will follow this particular risk assessment process for one department. They will identify the risk for that particular vertical or department. Then they will move on to the next department. They will identify the particular risks and threats from that particular process. And they will carry on the same process until and unless they have completely documented the number of risks identified. The third step would be analyzing the risks. Now, an organization has to analyze that are these risks an organization has to realize that what risks which they have identified has what kind of probability of occurring. What is the category of those particular risks? It means the probability of occurring a risk is high, medium, or low. And they will have to set the categories for all of the risks identified. Fourth step would be evaluating the risk. Now, an organization must have a criteria through which they need to evaluate the risk or prioritize the risk. Because after the risk assessment process, the second step is for risk treatment. So once an organization is performing a risk treatment, they will have to prioritize that what will be the risks which has to be treated first. And this can only be done when they have evaluated the potential threat of the risk. So they might give a number to that particular risk, that this particular risk is probability is very high. So when conducting the risk treatment plan, we should pick up this risk first and we should treat it first. And the final step would be select risk treatment options. The organization, while planning out about the risk assessment process, has to decide that what will be its risk treatment options. Risk treatment options will definitely be different for every identified risk. They will not be the similar process for all of the risk which has been identified. Now, if we go on further, we should understand that what is the objective of risk assessment process, that why it is actually needed by an organization. The risk assessment process determines the controls that you must deploy in your ISMS. It leads to the statement of applicability, which we will discuss later on in our further sessions, because statement of applicability is itself a very big topic, and we will discuss that what actually it is. The statement of applicability basically identifies the controls that you are deploying in light of your risk assessment process. The risk assessment procedure should be detailed and describe who is responsible for each task, when they must be completed, and in what order. As I already said, that while evaluating the risk, the prioritization of the risk should be done very carefully. By creating a risk assessment process, an organization usually capable itself to do the following things, which I have listed over here. The first one is define how to identify the risks that could cause the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and or availability of the information. The second one would be define how to identify the risk owners. Now, it is a very important point to notice over here. Once you have identified the risks and you have identified the assets which will be at risk due to those potential hazards and the impact as well, you need to document that who will be the risk owner, who will be responsible for communicating and conducting the risk treatment plan for that particular identified risk. So this needs to be documented as well, that who are the risk owners for what all sort of risk which has been identified. The third one, define criteria for assessing consequences and assessing the likelihood of the risk. It means that once the risk has been identified, there should be a criteria through which it is identified that what would be the consequences if this particular risk occurs within the organization, and what is the likelihood of this particular risk occurring at the organization. So this should be very clearly defined and identified. Define how the risk will be calculated. Now this depends from organization to organization. Every organization defines a criteria or a numbering through which they give a particular percentage to a risk which has been identified, and they set up its priority as well. So it might depend from organization to organization. They might use a different methodology for calculating the risk as well. Define criteria for accepting risk. Now, once the risk has been identified and the risk owners has been identified, there must be a criteria through which those risk owners should be accepting that particular risk. That yes, they are responsible, that this particular risk happened actually due to their any reason which has been identified, and they will be the responsible person who will be treating this risk further so that it doesn't occur again within the organization. Now, friends, we have already discussed about risk assessment as a generic term and in relation to ISO 27001 2013 as well. If we go into the details, that risk assessment, the risk assessment process within the ISO 27000 standard, then it actually covers a few requirements, and it actually demands an organization that they should match and meet these set of requirements while they are implementing information security management system within their organization. Actually, the clause 6.1.2 of ISO 27001-2013 talks about the risk assessment in detail. This clause states the below mentioned requirements, which I have already mentioned over here. The first one says the organization shall define and apply information security risk assessment process that establishes and maintains information security risk criteria, which includes the risk acceptance criteria, criteria for performing information security risk assessments, ensure that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results, identifies the information security risks. Then it also says that organization must apply the information risk security risk assessment process to identify risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for information within the scope of the information security management system, and identify the risk owners, analyze the information security risk to assess the potential consequences that would result if the risks identified are to materialize, assess the realistic likelihood of the occurrence of the risks identified in, determine the levels of risk, evaluate the information security risks, compare the results of risk analysis with the risk criteria established, prioritize the analyzed risk for risk treatment. So in detail, if we want to see that what does clause 6.1.2 of ISO 27001:2013 says, we should state that organizations must define and apply a risk assessment process which is efficient and always working. It also states that an organization shall retain documented information about the information security risk assessment process. It means that the organization should not just decide a framework which is to be implemented for the risk assessment. It should document it as well as an evidence and should be communicated to all the responsible persons who actually can follow this particular risk assessment process and do the needful for eliminating the identified risk from all of the processes and procedures. So now, as now we have discussed the risk assessment process, we should conclude this particular statement of risk assessment in this way. We need to understand that once an organization has defined a risk assessment process, it cannot rely on the same process for future risk catering as well. As with continuous development in the processes and operations of an organization, there will always be new set of risks and threats coming up. For example, if I want to discuss this through an example, I would say one example can be there will always be new employees joining the organization. Thus, they will not be aware about the organization's information security procedure, and hence they can pose a threat to it. Second example can be addition of assets or inventory within a department which are not covered and protected by firewalls, antiviruses, etc. So they will also pose a threat to the particular department or to the particular process. Due to this fact, the risk assessment process should always be reviewed by an organization at regular intervals. It should keep modifying the document which mentions the risks and threats and their treatment plan as well. Also, the organization should identify a set of capable persons who should always be responsible for carrying out the risk assessment process. Friends, I hope that you might have understood the complete risk assessment process terminology. Now, let us have a look at a simple risk assessment process prepared by an organization. For confidentiality purposes, I would not share the name of the organization over here. This will give us an idea that how the risk assessment process is documented and what are its key elements. Let me just show you the example on your screen. Friends, as you can see on your screen now, this is a particular risk assessment done by an organization, and they have set actually two criteria to define it. We will look at both of these Excel sheets one by one. The first sheet which is being displayed over here is the guidance on scoring. So as I just told you that the scoring and the optimization of all risks will depend from organization to organization. Here, the organization has defined two major categories: the probability of the risks and the business impact of these risks on the particular organization. So if we look at the probability, there are actually six categories which has been defined, five categories, sorry, which has been defined by the organization. The first category says the almost and certain risks which are whose probability is almost to happen. So the organization has decided that we are bound to experience further incidents of this nature. In fact, they are probably occurring right now. That is why their impact is 100%, as you can see, and it is an extreme risk. The second category is probable. Probable means they can happen or not. And that is why their category has been given as percentage of 80%, and they also falls under the scope of extreme If it is extreme, then it is 80%. If it's major, then it's 64%. If it's moderate, then 50%. If it's minor, then 20%. If the impact is insignificant, then it is 1%. The third category is possible, that this risk might be possibly happening within the organization. The percentage category is 62% for extreme, for 50 for major, 38 for moderate impact, 16% for minor impact, and 1% for insignificant impact. Unlikely, the fourth category, it means the organization has identified a few risks which might happen but are very unlikely to happen during the course of the organization process. That is why they have given it a very low percentage, as you can see, 25% for extreme, then for 20% for major, 16% for moderate, minor is 6%, and insignificant, that it is not going to happen as of now. The last category is rare. It means those risks which are very rarely believed to happen within an organization. That is why the percentage is very less. It's absolutely minimal, 1% for probably all of the categories, and extreme, moderate, and major have only 1%, minor and insignificant are 0. So this is the actually categorization, that how this particular organization identifies their risks and what rating do they give to the identified risk, in what procedure format. Now, this is particular a risk assessment sheet of this particular organization, in which they have put a few risks which they have identified, and I would just click on the reference elements which has been mentioned in the sheet. The first element is the risk ID. So they have given it a particular number through which they can identify this particular set of risks. The second is the name of the risk. Third is the asset owner, or you can say the risk owner, the impact of this particular risk on the organization, the probability of this particular risk, the probable impact of this particular risk, the rating of this particular risk, what will be the treatment that an organization will do for eliminating this particular risk, what will be the cost which will be incurred for the treatment of this particular risk. As of now, what is the status of the treatment, what percentage they have treated this particular risk to, treated probability, treated impact, target risk rating, and current risk rating. Target risk rating means what is the absolute percentage of a risk to which they want to get it reduced to. They have identified a few risks over here. I'll just point it out one by one. The first risk which has been identified is production data center internet outage. The risk owner is the network administrator. What will be the impact of this particular risk on the organization? Loss in production. The probability of occurring this risk is 70%. The impact is 46%. The rating is 32. What will be the treatment of this particular risk? High-end bandwidth network backup should be there within the organization so that this risk can be eliminated. What will be the cost of incurring this particular treatment? It will be rupees 10,000, they have mentioned. As of now, they have achieved the 60% treatment. The treated probability is 70%. The treated impact is 46%. They want to reduce this particular risk to 32%. The second risk, which has been mentioned over here, is production servers malware. The risk owner is system administrator. The impact of this particular risk on the organization is loss of data. Probability is 80%. Impact is 55%. Rating is 44%. What will be the treatment plan? Use of anti-malware software. What will be the cost for doing this particular treatment? 8,000 rupees. The treatment status is 75%. It means they have treated this particular risk up to a category of 75%. The probability is 80%. The impact is 55%. And they want it to get reduced to 44%. The third risk is production servers corruption of data. The risk owner is system administrator. The impact is duplicacy of data. The probability is 75%. The impact is 52% and the rating is 39%. Now, as you can see in this particular sheet, they have not mentioned the treatment plan for this identified risk as of now. And this is an error because they have already listed out here that the treated probability is 75%, the treated impact is 52%, and they want it to reduce it to 39%. So they will have to plan about this particular risk treatment. Compromising of user credentials. The Chief Information Security Officer is the risk owner of this particular risk. The impact of this particular risk on the business would be loss of organizational accounts to bad access. The probability would be 60%. The impact would be 38%. The rating would be 23%. And the treatment would be use of phishing detection software. The cost which will be incurred for doing this particular treatment will be rupees 15,000. The treatment status is 65%. They have achieved this particular treatment up to a percentage of 65. The probability is 60. The impact is 38%. They want it to get reduced to 23%. So as you can see, they have identified these several kind of risks. 7 risks they have identified, and if you see down here, they have identified and given it a risk ID of EID 1108. It's a unique ID which has been assigned to this particular risk so that it can be easily identified by the risk owner and by the risk assessment team as well. So friends, this was just an example that how an organization should actually plan its risk assessment process and prepare the complete risk assessment register in which they have to identify, which they have to document the identified risks and have to fill all the details which has been just showed by me over here on the screen. I hope that this particular session was fruitful to all of our participants today. I hope to see you again. Till then, it's goodbye from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Malik, for this wonderful session. I thank you, Mr. Malik, from the bottom of my heart for taking time from your busy schedule to be the guest speaker at our webinar. Your presence and wise words helped magnify our cause in the best possible way. All thanks to your enlightening words that inspired us and so many other participants out there. I cannot thank you enough for gracing our webinar, revitalizing all our spirits and making everyone feel happy to get technically upgraded. I look forward to our next interaction soon. Wishing you all the best. Thank you so much, Mr. Malik. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Spain. The pleasure is entirely mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.